Happy Monday to you. This is the beginning of week 10. This is the first video in a series of 3 for the week about news and news releases. This first one is going to cover primarily information related to the supplemental chapter 5 from Smith. That's the first PDF that's about news and public relations, because I want you to have a sense of what constitutes news before you go into some of the technical aspects of crafting a news release. Both of these chapters, these supplemental chapters from Smith, and it is the same Smith as our textbook, are somewhat expanded from the information that's included in your course textbook. So I included these two chapters, even though they're both, some of the information is a little bit repetitive, but there's more detail, and then they are longer chapters, but both chapter 5 and chapter 8 have some examples in them that kind of contribute to them being a little bit longer. So just wanted to give you some context and a heads up on what these chapters have in store. And I have to apologize if you can hear my heaters in my office. It's really cold outside today on Monday, and my heaters, since I'm in a really old building, clang pretty loudly. So I apologize if if you can hear them, and if they're at all distracting, I apologize. But I have to keep them on, otherwise I get really, really cold. So the first, chapter 5, Smith talks about, what makes news. He mentions that there's, almost as many different definitions as there are people, but he points out that for the purpose of public relations and communications efforts, really news is whatever a media gatekeeper says it is. So a gatekeeper is the person who makes the decision about whether or not to publish. And most often that's some type of an editor, whether it's a newspaper online or in print, or a magazine, or some sort of online or digital publication. There's always an editor sort of determining, keeping that gate, determining if this is indeed news. And so in the chapter 5, he talks about some of these questions in detail about how to recognize, and then even more importantly for you, how to generate it, or how to look for news ideas and elements within the organization that you either represent or work in. He talks a little bit about, what constitutes or what makes something newsworthy. And then he also talks about in this chapter how to enhance the news value of different activities that your organization may complete. So those are topics that he talks about in the chapter. I'm not going to go over all of these because I do have, I've separated this sort of lecture into 3 separate pieces. But those are some pretty helpful things that can contribute to you having some good ideas for your news release, client project news release. One of the things I really liked about this chapter 5 that Smith has in there is this idea of the model of overlapping news interests. And he gives a lengthy description of this, but one of the things I really like about this diagram is that it visualizes how news interests really can overlap. So here you have, if you're representing your organization, you as a public relations or a strategic communication practitioner probably always operate in this area in terms of sharing information about your organization. And then you have a public or publics, and then you have their areas of key interests. As their interests overlap with what your organization has to share, you can see there's some common interest here in the A and C area. As information about your organization is deemed interesting and newsworthy by news media, you've got that little A-B overlap here. But as you can see, that kind of cuts out the interests of your public or publics. And so really what you're aiming for and looking for information that is worthy of a news release of any kind is what hits in this news sweet spot, where it satisfies information about your organization that you want to share, it meets the interests of at least one key public of your organization, and it meets the interests of news media. And so when you hit in this ABC sweet spot, that is when you will most likely see the best coverage of your news release. So you kind of want to aim for this this middle sweet spot as you are thinking about what types of topics and pieces of information you might want to include in a news release. I think I might have mentioned this in a previous presentation, but it's worth noting again that really the news release is considered a fundamental or foundational public relations tactic. It is the one that you'll see most often related to any kind of communication with an external audience on behalf of any kind of organization. And the main reason for this, I really like that Smith's supplemental chapter 8, the print news release chapter, really mentioned, it's because the news release is versatile. When we return from spring break, we're going to start talking about digital and social media and how those have kind of amped up practicing strategic communication. We will revisit the idea of a news release a little bit when we start talking about some of the characteristics of social and digital news releases and what makes them different and interesting and how they're structured a little differently. But as I think he writes in this chapter, he talks about how there was a period of time when digital and social first came about that people thought, the news release, the press release is going to die. And actually what's happened is it's evolved beyond some of the more traditional stuff that we're going to talk about in terms of structure and the elements that go into a news release. But as we talk next time, next week, the week after next, after spring break, we'll show you how the news release has adapted for the 21st century. So one of the greatest things about news releases is that if they're done well, they can really build public awareness for your organization and the particular topic of the news release. So knowing what makes a strong news release gives you a better chance, a better opportunity to get that news release covered as a news article, sometimes even printed verbatim, depending on the size of the publication and how much staff they have to rewrite stories or to make a full story out of it. But knowing what makes a strong news release really can be helpful to you. So key elements are newsworthy information. Another one is this idea of professional formatting. And there are some elements of formatting that are still adhered to, even though most releases anymore are digital. But there are some expectations, and making sure that you meet those expectations, again, gets you a higher likelihood that your information will be used or covered. Making sure that the release, whatever the topic is, that it's well written and that it's written in an objective style and written in a news style. And then that you pay attention to who the audience of the news organization is that you're sending your release to. And so that you're meeting the needs of the editor, who's that gatekeeper, and making sure that they're going to be interested in it. Your release, and then making sure that you're thinking about the editor's audience as well. So certain elements that go into things that can help you get covered as you release news and information from your organization. So if you think about key components for news releases, because they're news releases, like a massively key component, probably the most important component, is this idea of news. And so again, Smith talks about what makes news and what makes something newsworthy. His definition, and I believe this is in the supplemental chapter, information that's important, previously unreported, and dealing with a topic having significant impact for a large number of people. There's some caveats there. Important. Well, what's important to one large group of people may not be important to another large group of people, so you've got to recognize that. This idea of previously unreported. When we talked about theories, we noticed that in agenda setting theory that there is an instance of several organizations, several news outlets covering the same topic, And so when you think about news previously unreported doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be previously unreported by any other organization, although that's the choice. A lot of times if your news organization is publishing a story that another news organization has published on that topic, as long as your news organization has some sort of angle or a different piece of information that can make things a little bit more new and shiny, that is attractive to your gatekeepers. And then making sure that the topic has an impact for a large number of people. Okay, so I think in our Smith book, our textbook for the course, and then again in the supplemental reading, there is this idea of Smith gives a sort of a formula that combines the first few letters of each of these words. So the idea of the issue being significant, well, that means that it's interesting or impactful for a number of people and beyond your organization. So it's not just of interest to people in your organization, but beyond that. And that it has some consequence or some size element to it. And really it sort of goes beyond the just so what question. It answers more than that in terms of being significant. Local is something that is defined by the news outlet that you are aiming for. So it can be something that's geographic. If you're aiming something at the Lincoln, or if you're aiming something that is local to Lincoln, it could be that you're aiming for the Lincoln Journal-Star. But if it's of interest to eastern Nebraska, it might be local to the Omaha World Herald and the Lincoln Journal-Star or something like that. So local doesn't necessarily restrict itself to geographic. It can be based on the interests of a particular audience for a particular publication. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. This idea of balance, again, we see the idea that you present information with an air of neutrality. The idea here is that, yes, as a public relations professional, you're advocating or you're acting on behalf of your own organization, but you really want to make sure you do that in as balanced a way as possible and that you don't hype or exaggerate or give outsized credit to your organization. And then there's the idea of timeliness, which, again, is sort of defined in context. Although as I've heard many times, there's nothing older than or nothing staler than old news, making sure that you are publishing or you're sending out information about an event before the event, and then maybe it's relevant also to send out a sort of a wrap-up release or something like that. But you want to make sure that you do things like this, that issue news releases in a timely fashion so that it's not perceived as stale news. Two more key components. This first idea of unusualness, right, often referred to as human interest. I thought this was a great potentially human interest piece, although it's more animal interest. But it's about Florida looking for people to kill some of these massive pythons that are loose in the Everglades. This has been a thing for the last several years. When I was in graduate school in Florida, they just started doing this. And these pythons are such a problem that what they do is they open up like a hunting season almost for people to find these pythons and kill them. And so definitely there's an element of unusualness in the story here. So something that can be, rare, novel, something that's a milestone sometimes within an organization, or things that are slightly offbeat, like this particular story. Then there's that last element, which is fame. And a great example of this is sort of things surrounding Meryl Streep related to her comments about President Trump in her Golden Globe speech, which was something that was, had that element of fame as a newsworthy item. But became even more interesting related to specifically her, Meryl Streep, as being a very famous woman, and being recognized for a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Golden Globes. And so her speaking out at that time really made coverage of this issue much more interesting. And so that element of fame really came into play. So some more items that I want you to be aware of. The idea of hard news versus soft news. And the idea of hard news is really generally things that fall on the front page of a newspaper like this. And then even more so, this is the front page laid full out of the New York Times. Usually when you see it, if it's on a newsstand or something, it's folded in half. And so what you see is just sort of the part that's what we call above the fold. And for sure, the stories that you see above the fold in a newspaper like this are definitely going to be hard news oriented. They're going to be things like what's going on in the political sphere, if there have been any natural disasters, elections, major sporting events like the World Series or the All-Star Game with the NBA, or the NBA Finals or baseball finals or things like that. And then also, within this hard news sphere, there is breaking news, and that is when hard news is getting covered, is getting written about as it's happening. Okay, so that's sort of the idea that the story is breaking, happening right now, and ongoing. Both this idea of hard news and breaking news are really, really essential to understand if you're interested at all in crisis communication or crisis public relations. Those really have a lot of oomph in terms of working for an organization and making sure that you understand how to handle that news and how to respond to it. And then there's this idea of soft news that's lighter in fare, that has to do with things that are sort of warm and fuzzy. Here's an example of a story. I have some colleagues and friends at the University of Georgia, and I recently saw a tweet from one of them. It looks like they had their spring break last week, and so they were highlighting here a tour that College of Ag and Environmental Studies students, or environmental sciences students at the University of Georgia did during their spring break about the diversity of agriculture in the state of Georgia. So something that is not breaking news, that's not hard news, but that is interesting, and it's about, a program, a set of activities, and then, sort of an alternative spring break, which is always an attractive story. So be sure that you're familiar with the idea of hard news versus soft news. And I can tell you that the most of you, for the topic for your news release, you will have something that is more soft news. Chances are there won't be a whole lot of hard news topics and stories for our news releases. One other thing I want to tell you before we go on any further is that this idea of determining news and newsworthiness is something that kind of develops over time. So I don't expect that after this one, set of videos in this one class, even that you're going to be able to without fail determine when something is newsworthy and when it's not. This is something that's a skill acquired over time. So just kind of be aware of that. You're starting to build your sense of news and newsworthiness here. Then there's this idea of specialized news, so news that is of a particular interest to people who subscribe to or look to a certain part of a publication. So the example here, and I'm sorry you can't see the agri-marketing part, or the agri part of the agri-marketing cover there. But another great example is Forbes, and Forbes is a very focused magazine on business and finance and profit and that kind of thing, innovation, those types of things. And another example, these are two specialized targeted publications, but another example is, the style section or the food section. So that's all specialized news that has particular interest to people in one of these, areas of interest that are beyond the general. Okay. So when you think about another key component, I would encourage you to be aware that this idea of a news peg is something that you want to seek as much as possible to do. So the idea of a news peg is connecting the topic and messages in your news release to something that's going on already in society, something that's getting covered in the news or some event that's already happening. A great example of this is last week on Wednesday was International Women's Day. And so various organizations and companies were tying in things that they do at their own organization or creating events or writing releases about how they support women in their workplace. So the news peg for both the Inova release here and the UN Women's Group Council, and both of these are linked to the original sources, so you can look at those if you want. And then there's actually a link to other coverage here that you might be interested in if you're interested in International Women's Day. But both of these organizations used the news peg of International Women's Day and talked about how their organizations are participating. There's also a link here from the Purdue Online Writing Lab about newsworthiness that might be of interest to you. Purdue Online Writing Lab is a great resource in terms of different styles of writing, and so they have some information for you on newsworthiness. If we think a little bit more about the key components and structure, these are the elements that last week in week 9, the week 9 activity, you looked for. You looked for the lead, the benefit statement, all of these different components for in a news release. And so just to refresh your mind really quickly, the lead is that first sentence or paragraph. Some sources say that it's the whole paragraph. Some sources say that it's just the first sentence. But basically it's what sets up the news release and is sort of the gateway to the rest of the story. And then the idea is that a summary news lead basically gives you a summarization of the who, what, where, when, why, and how. The benefit statement is really about the advantage of whatever the topic of the news release is to the audience. It's essentially the difference between a news story that's written by a journalist or a reporter and a news release that's written by a strategic communications professional. The benefit statement is, how is this information going to benefit someone? And is sort of answers the, so what, why should I care, and what's in it for me? And oftentimes this can be a quote that is used or that is provided from an executive or somebody connected with the organization. There's the information action statement, which is usually it's sort of the how-to component about either how to get more information or how to participate, how to join an event. It can be as simple as directing people to a website to buy tickets or more information. The idea of secondary detail is really sort of an amplification of the who, what, where, when, why, and how stuff that didn't necessarily get covered before in the lead. Then there's the idea of background information. And background information, you want to be careful. That's background information about the context or the topic of the release, not background about your client organization. Because the organizational ID, or what's often called the boilerplate, and there's more on that in the next video, but that organizational identification, the boilerplate statement, is really, that's where you give some information about the organization in general. So there's a couple of examples here that you can take a look at and try and find these different elements. One thing I will say, and somebody asked a question last week, which was a good one, via email, was, do these elements always have to be in this order? And the way that Smith lays them out, it looks like you should expect them in that order. But as I looked through several different examples, I found that the information action statement, secondary details, and background especially are all kind of mixed up. And sometimes the benefit statement doesn't come till the end. So I think the thing to think about is that, as a rule of thumb, this might be a good way to arrange your information, but that it is not a hard and fast rule that these elements, these components of structure of a release, have to be in this order. I think you need to ask yourself what's best for the situation that you're writing for. So thinking about, we've talked about news now, but what kinds of topics? So newsworthy information. Well, what are potential newsworthy items? And so these are, in the next video, you're going to hear a little bit more about these specific types of topics and these different types of releases. So a publicity release, a product release, financial, event announcement, personnel, and tips and hints. And I think in the supplemental chapter that Smith has on news releases, he mentions a few more. I'm not so concerned that you memorize these types of releases, but what I am concerned about is that you understand what are the types of things that are commonly written about in news releases, and give you some ideas, help you get some ideas for your own client project news release. All right, so that's it. Yep. So I will talk to you in just a couple minutes about the second set in the second video about types of news releases.